So, with this new Spider-Man movie coming out, I've decided to talk about a few other Spider-Man movies in anticipation for No Way Home. And we'll start with the very first one, which is just called Spider-Man. In my mind, this is the best Spider-Man movie. Or it was, when it came out. There's a much better Spider-Man movie right after this, and there are some elements of this movie that, to be honest, have not really aged well. Mainly the early 2000s CGI. There's a lot of shots in this movie where Spider-Man's swinging around and it never really looks real to me. There's also some very cringeworthy dialogue that's a bit reminiscent of the Star Wars prequel trilogy. However, I still think this is a pretty fun flick with countless memorable moments, a great score, and a lot of reverence for the character. This movie's also incredibly rewatchable. Or that might just be me, since I've seen this movie close to 100 times and can quote the entire thing from beginning to end. Now on the topic of casting, all these actors fill their roles incredibly well, and I honestly can't see anyone else playing any of these roles. Sure, some actors here are way better than others, like Willem Dafoe for example. Every scene of him I find incredibly entertaining, even if he isn't doing anything in the scene. He dances the perfect line of comedy and drama, and I don't know why, Green Goblin's just one of those characters I can watch for hours. Tobey Maguire I've always viewed as my ideal Spider-Man. Here's who I think of when I think of movie Spider-Man. He was able to put a lot of relatability and sympathy into his performance as Peter Parker, which worked very well. I haven't seen another actor in the role pull it off the same way. This whole movie has a lot of heart to it and really makes you care about Spider-Man, which is the key. Not just in superhero movies, but in movies in general. Yeah, it's cool when he's swinging around, but if I don't care, what's the point? People today may be taken aback that it's kind of over the top, which is kind of the point. It's about a comic book, about a man who can climb walls and shoot webs that was bitten by a radioactive spider. So, I think it's probably fine. So in conclusion, I would give Spider-Man 1 an A-. Let's talk about Spider-Man 2 now. This movie is good as heck. I love how this movie really focuses on the duality of Spider-Man and Peter Parker. It shows how much Peter is struggling with both aspects of his life, especially when those aspects intertwine, which happens quite often in this movie. This movie shows that there's a lot of consequences for being Spider-Man, and Peter now isn't sure he can handle it. Now here's the deal. I intentionally didn't mention Mary Jane in the first movie, other than saying there's some cringeworthy dialogue. And that's basically because Mary Jane is the worst person ever. In Spider-Man 1, she cheats on Harry with Spider-Man. Then she cheats on Spider-Man with Peter Parker. Oh wait.
I think I always knew.
No. You didn't. Then she's being all flirty with Peter. Then she's like, oh, by the way, I'm seeing someone. Sorry, what? Where did that come from? I love this movie, but this plot line has always annoyed me. It comes out of nowhere and really makes no sense, especially with this line earlier.
She's waiting for you, pal.
So how is she waiting for him when she's seeing someone? It just don't make no sense. It just feels like a plot line that was thrown in at the last minute, because it genuinely makes no sense why she would be trying to see if he's still interested if she has a boyfriend. I understand why they're doing this to make Peter's life miserable because of all his responsibility as Spider-Man, but this whole thing really came out of nowhere and it really seems like Mary Jane was just saying this to mess with him. But later on, we see that she wasn't kidding, and she really does have a boyfriend, and then later agrees to marry him. Oh, and it just so happens to be J. Jonah Jameson's son. Man, I feel bad for Peter in this movie. Everyone is either mean or just passive-aggressive towards him. But there's one person that isn't mean or passive-aggressive, and that's Doc Ock. Otto Octavius. You know, I know, I'm just gonna say Doc Ock. Doc Ock is a very interesting villain in this movie because you can see that he wanted to make a change in the world, but his tentacles fuse to his brain and they take control of him, making him do things he wouldn't normally do. It's different from Green Goblin because he's horrified by what he's become in the end, and helps Spider-Man by drawing the sun that he created in the river. Doc Ock is still pretty similar to Green Goblin because it's very Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde inspired, in that the villain essentially doesn't really have any recollection of his villain side, and it's very much like duality between Otto and Doc Ock. Same with Norman. There's very much duality between Norman and Green Goblin. He's also the second villain in the Raimiverse that kills himself, so there's that. So Doc Ock is a pretty great foe for Spider-Man, and it's because of Doc Ock that we also have the greatest superhero scene in all of cinema. The train scene. There is so much about this scene that's good. Namely, this is Spider-Man at his absolute most heroic. He has never saved this many people in his life. with this big of a chance of failure. Also, there's something kind of beautiful about the scene, in that Spider-Man saves all these normal, mild-mannered people that are just like him, and then through him saving them, they decide to act heroic by defending him from Doc Ock. Of course, they couldn't do anything against him, but it's a very interesting concept that someone who really is just like them was able to inspire them to stand up against someone who, to everyone else, seemed impenetrable. That's what makes this scene so compelling to me. So Mary Jane, the absolute worst character, is about to go through with the wedding, and then she's like, nope, and then just runs away. That is messed up. Nothing about this is romantic, but okay, fine. So this movie's pretty good, but too much Mary Jane. Let's watch Spider-Man 3. Okay, so this movie's bad. Everyone knows that this movie's bad. But here's the deal. Between you and me, it's not as bad as people say it is. Okay, I acknowledge that there is some dumb stuff in this movie, but this movie is actually trying to tell a good story, even if it's crowded with a lot of dumb stuff. I'll just get the bad stuff out of the way first. There's too many villains. They should just focused on one villain in this movie. Harry. It would make the most sense since tensions have been brewing between him and Spider-Man since the first movie. So I expected him to be the main villain, and he is! For the first 10 minutes. Then he gets amnesia, so Sandman is introduced. After Sandman is turned to sand, we meet Eddie Brock, who becomes Venom in the last 15 minutes. If you can't tell already, the pacing in this movie is not good. We aren't given any time to breathe in between meeting new villains, and it all feels very jumbled and messy. Compared to the first two movies, where everything was paced pretty well, and we got to focus on one villain primarily, which worked so they can flesh out everything about the villain as well as the hero throughout the movie. While this movie decides to focus on 4, if you count Peter's subconscious. I know others have said this in the past, but it's too much in too small of a runtime to have this many characters. Also, because I don't know half of these villains. Sandman, for example. I don't really know anything about him, except he has a sick daughter, and he's an escaped convict that apparently killed Uncle Ben. It's not the guy with the weird hair. This movie doesn't really give me any reason to care about him other than reminding me that he has a sick daughter. As a way for the audience to have some sort of sympathy for him, but that's not enough. You actually have to flesh out the characters. In Spider-Man 1 and 2, you are with Otto and Norman a good amount of time before they turn bad, as well as after they turn bad. So you understand them as characters and why they are doing what they're doing, and you sympathize with them to a certain extent. And you understand why they turn bad. They turn bad in both situations because their experiments altered them. All I know about Sandman from this movie is that he's an escaped convict with a sick daughter. Why should I care? Be prepared to die with that question in mind, because the movie doesn't answer that. Then we have...
Smell. It's Brock, sir. Edward Brock Jr.
Right.
Can I just say I really like that shirt?
Who is Venom for about 15 minutes, so I would barely consider him a main villain at all. Even before he becomes Venom, he's not a character that has any kind of personal vendetta against Peter, or is even a foil to Peter. He's just a douchebag. And then the movie wants me to care when he's fired. He deserved it. He completely deserved it. This is also going back to the pacing problem I mentioned earlier, because after he's fired, we don't see him for like 30 minutes, and I honestly forgot he existed. If you're gonna set him up as a main villain, don't you think you should have shown him a bit earlier? And maybe shown him feeling spiteful towards Peter so we actually know what he's going through? Because this scene comes on, and I have to remind myself, oh! That guy. I also love how everything is just so convenient in this movie, how Eddie just so happened to be at the same exact church Peter was at as he was taking out the symbiote. Or like earlier in the movie when Peter was lying on his web hammock and then the meteorite containing the symbiote lands right in front of him and he doesn't notice somehow. The only villain that I actually kind of care about in this movie, who is only a villain for about 10 minutes in total, is Harry, because he had development in the first 2 movies, so you have a reason to care about him at this point. In terms of good stuff, I love the Birth of Sandman scene. It's a great example of wordless storytelling, and the effects have aged pretty well. I like the fight scene with Harry and Peter in the beginning, even though it makes no sense how Harry can just attack him from behind since he has the spider sense, but whatever. It's a very exciting fight scene. The main thing that keeps me interested is the wedding ring, since there's a big chance it could be knocked out of Peter's hand. The score is actually my favorite of the whole trilogy, and I can't play it right now for obvious reasons because I don't want Sony yelling at me, but it helps elevate a lot of the scenes of this movie. I also like the conflict this movie creates between Harry and Peter. how they're now estranged from each other because of the reveal that Peter is Spider-Man. This is how I always wanted to see this part of the finale play out. The division between Harry and Peter that eventually would erupt in conflict, killing Harry. It just wasn't executed as I would have hoped. I also like the look of the black suit. I just thought it looked really cool. He only wore it while quickly swinging around and then saying,
"This is something else."
And then the Sandman fight, and then afterwards, he ripped it off in a tower. I would have liked to see more of the suit and maybe have it be the only suit in the movie and then bring the idea of removing it in Spider-Man 4, but you know, what's done is done. This movie also does a good job of dividing Peter and MJ with the Gwen Stacy kiss, because I fully understand both perspectives of the conflict, and when you thought it was bad, it got much worse when it was revealed that Peter actually knows Gwen. This divides both of them since they both viewed they were right, and this anger towards MJ and wanting to be left alone attracts the symbiote to him. Which, by the way, the whole thing where the symbiote is just in his room waiting, that doesn't make any sense. Because the whole concept of a symbiote is that it has to be part of a living being to survive. What was it doing the whole time? Eating rats? You never see it happen. So I don't know how it's surviving. Anyway, I also like the internal struggle of Peter wanting to find his uncle's killer as an act of revenge, but not being sure it's the right thing to do. I thought it was portrayed well with him listening to the police dispatcher, but only thinking of where Flint Marko can be, and not helping anyone else in New York, but trying to stay focused on the rest of New York, but can't seem to do it. But when he goes to sleep, his mind goes to the thought of his uncle getting shot by Flint Marko, which enrages him more and attracts the symbiote. So that's all I got for Spider-Man 3. Overall, it's not good. It's a crowded, jumbled mess with too many characters, but if you dig deep, there's something good there. I'll give it a C. Pretty flick.